The two houses stood side by side for more than 20 years, their yards divided by a fence that was supposed to mark boundaries, but instead became the starting line of a war. It began with something small, a disagreement over where the fence should sit. One neighbor insisted it was pushed too far into his property. The other claimed it was exactly where it belonged. At first it was just a heated exchange, words spoken with frustration but not yet with hatred. But pride is a seed that grows quickly when watered by anger. What should have ended in a single conversation stretched into years of bitterness. The main character, a man in his 50s, carried the weight of that feud heavily. Each time he stepped into his yard, he felt the tension like a storm hanging low over the fence. The smallest things, his neighbor mowing too close, a branch falling on the wrong side, even the sound of a laugh from the other yard, were enough to stir his resentment. What once was a peaceful home had become a place of quiet hostility, a reminder that sometimes the hardest battles are not fought in distant lands, but right next door. His pride told him he couldn't back down. To apologize, even to speak kindly, would mean admitting he was wrong, and he wasn't wrong. He held tightly to that truth, as though letting it go would erase his dignity. But beneath the surface of his stubbornness, there was something else, a deep exhaustion. Each holiday when his children visited, they avoided the fence line. Each summer, family barbecues were dampened by the awareness that laughter carried into the yard of someone who despised them. Pride gave him the illusion of strength, but in reality, it had chained him to years of loneliness. The neighbors stopped speaking altogether. Their wives exchanged only the coldest of nods when paths crossed at the market. Children who once played across the lawns grew up learning to keep their distance. A small line of wood and nails had become a wall of silence, and the man often found himself staring at it, wondering if this was what life was meant to be, a long list of grudges carried until the end. Still, he said nothing. His neighbor said nothing. And the years passed, one bitter season after another, with the fence standing tall between them like a monument to stubbornness. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the fence in long shadows, the man sat quietly on his porch. His wife joined him, bringing 2 cups of tea. She didn't speak at first. She simply sat beside him, the silence wrapping around them like a gentle blanket. She had long understood that some words needed to be spoken slowly, like seeds placed carefully in the soil. After a while, she finally said what had been resting on her heart for years. She told him that the house no longer felt like a home, not because of its walls or its roof, but because of the weight they carried in their hearts. She reminded him how much joy used to fill their days before anger seeped in through the cracks. Her voice was not sharp or accusing. It was soft, almost like a lullaby. She told him that sometimes winning an argument meant losing something greater, peace. The man sat still, staring at the fence as though it might speak back. His pride rose quickly, telling him she didn't understand. He had been right from the very beginning. Why should he give up that truth? But as the evening deepened and the stars began to appear, her words lingered. He thought of his children and how they avoided mentioning the neighbors' names, as though speaking them might reopen wounds. He thought of the laughter that used to spill easily across both yards, now silenced by years of resentment. His wife placed her hand on his and said something that shook him. That carrying anger was like carrying a burning coal. It burned the hand that held it more than the one it was meant for. He felt the truth of that image settle into him. The anger that once made him feel strong had only hollowed him out. He saw how tired his own reflection had grown over the years, how many evenings he had wasted glaring at that fence instead of enjoying the family that still sat beside him. That night, long after his wife went to bed, he sat alone, wrestling with his pride. The thought of apologizing, of stepping across that line, felt impossible. He had never been the kind of man to admit defeat. Yet somewhere inside, a question began to rise, quiet but persistent. Was holding on to pride really worth the cost of peace? The next morning carried a kind of stillness that felt different, as though the air itself was urging him to act. He rose earlier than usual, his steps heavy as he walked toward the fence. Each step stirred his pride, whispering that he didn't need to do this, that the years of silence had already defined their relationship. Yet another voice, softer but clearer, reminded him of his wife's words and the hollowness he felt each time he clung to anger. His neighbor was already outside, tending to his yard. The sight of him, bent over pulling weeds, made the man's heart pound. For years he had seen this figure as an enemy, but at that moment, he noticed something different. The slump of his neighbor's shoulders, the weariness in his movements. Time had weighed on both of them. They were not rivals in some grand battle. They were two aging men, standing on either side of a fence that had taken far too much from their lives. He cleared his throat, but no words came at first. His pride clung tightly, urging him to turn back. But he forced himself forward, leaning gently against the fence. With a trembling voice, he spoke words he had rehearsed 100 times in silence, but never dared to say aloud. He apologized, not for being wrong about the fence, but for the years of hostility, for the distance that had grown between their families. He admitted that carrying anger had stolen more from him than losing an argument ever could. The neighbor looked up, startled, his eyes narrowing as if to test the sincerity of what he had just heard. For a moment, the silence stretched long and uncertain. Then the man noticed a shift. The hardness in his neighbor's face softened. The suspicion melted into something fragile, almost relieved. Slowly, the neighbor set down his tools and walked closer. He didn't argue. He didn't correct. He simply nodded and said that he too was tired of the years lost. Something broke in that moment, not in a way that caused pain, but in a way that released it. The fence still stood, but it no longer felt like a wall. The man felt a weight lift from his chest, a lightness he hadn't felt in decades. He went back inside, where his wife watched him with quiet tears in her eyes, knowing without words what had just happened. Peace had finally returned, not because he won, but because he chose to let go. And in that choice, he discovered that peace was the greater victory all along. In life, we all carry fences, boundaries built from pride, misunderstandings, and the need to be right. Yet when we look closely, we realize those fences often trap us more than they protect us. Choosing peace over pride does not mean we lose. It means we free ourselves from the weight of anger. The story of two neighbors shows us that the quiet courage to forgive can heal wounds that years of arguments never could. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to reflect. Where in your life can you choose peace over pride? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you found meaning here, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to join us for more stories that inspire reflection and growth.